So there I was, Captain Maya Rodriguez, standing in the docking bay of the most advanced space station in the galaxy, watching a bunch of alien diplomats lose their collective minds over my travel companion. And by travel companion, I mean Boris, my 400-pound Siberian tiger, who was currently sitting like a perfect gentleman beside me, occasionally yawning and showing off teeth that could probably cut through their precious hull plating. The Galactic Council had been very specific in their invitation. Send your best diplomat, they said. Someone who represents the pinnacle of human civilization, they said. What they didn't say was that they expected said diplomat to arrive alone, like some kind of antisocial hermit. Then creature, squeaked Ambassador Veltar, a purple blob that apparently counted as sentient life, is an apex predator. Unrestrained, untrained. This is barbaric. I couldn't help but grin. Barbaric? Boris here has better manners than half the politicians back on Earth. Don't you, big guy? Boris looked up at me with those amber eyes that had seen 3 years of deep space travel and probably wondered why we couldn't have just stayed home where the food was better. He made a soft chuffing sound that I'd learned meant either yes or can we eat the purple thing. The station's main corridor stretched out before us like something from a fever dream. Everything was smooth, sterile, and white. No sharp edges, no natural textures. Nothing that might remind these civilized beings that somewhere in the universe life still had claws and fangs and the audacity to use them. Your species, announced Counselor Zephram, a tall, stick-thin creature with too many eyes, was invited to demonstrate your readiness to join galactic society. This display suggests you are still primitive savages who consort with monsters. Monsters? I looked down at Boris, who had started grooming his paw with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was pretending not to listen to the insults. This monster helped me fix the navigation system when we hit that asteroid field near Proxima. He's also trained in basic medical assistance, can operate 3 different types of airlocks, and makes excellent company during those long, boring stretches between star systems. The aliens exchanged glances that somehow managed to be condescending despite coming from creatures that looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts in a cosmic junkyard. Trained? Scoffed Ambassador Krelthax, whose jellyfish-like form pulsed with what I assumed was indignation. Apex predators cannot be truly trained. They merely tolerate proximity, until hunger or instinct overcomes their temporary compliance. I was starting to understand why Earth's first contact protocols included a section on managing your homicidal impulses during diplomatic missions. Well, I said, scratching Boris behind the ears, I guess we'll just have to see about that, won't we? Ambassador Krelthax pulsed a particularly aggressive shade of orange, which, according to my hastily downloaded xenobiology guide, meant either diplomatic outrage or acute indigestion. With these aliens, it was honestly hard to tell the difference. Captain Rodriguez, he announced, his voice carrying the kind of authority that probably impressed other jellyfish. The Galactic Council has reached a decision. Your creature must be contained in a maximum security holding facility for the duration of these proceedings, or your species will be denied membership in the Alliance. I felt my diplomatic smile slip just a notch. Contained? Boris isn't some rabid animal. He's my partner. Partner? Counselor Zephram's multiple eyes widened in what I hoped was surprise and not the prelude to some kind of alien seizure. You cannot partner with an apex predator. They are killing machines, monsters driven by base instinct and hunger. Oh, this should be good, I muttered, then louder. What exactly makes you the experts on monsters? The assembled delegates exchanged those irritating looks again. Veltar, the purple blob, began to vibrate with what I assumed was excitement to share their cosmic wisdom. The Veltari homeworld, he squeaked, was once terrorized by creatures we call the Screaming Shadows. Massive, predatory beings that hunted in packs. We tried for centuries to coexist, but they remained savage. We had no choice but to drive them to extinction. The razor fins of Aquatica Prime, added another delegate, a fish-like creature whose name tag read Ambassador Glubpoor. Apex predators of our oceans, completely untamable. We built underwater cities specifically to avoid them. I looked down at Boris, who had rolled onto his back and was now batting playfully at a floating speck of dust. Real terrifying, this one. Let me get this straight, I said. Your solution to apex predators was either genocide or hiding in underwater bunkers? We are civilized beings, Krelthax declared, his tentacles waving dramatically. We evolved beyond the need for such primitive associations. Violence is the domain of lesser species. Lesser species? I could feel my diplomatic training wrestling with my natural instinct to introduce these pompous idiots to a few choice Earth expressions. You're telling me that learning to work with other species instead of murdering them makes us primitive? Working with them is impossible, Zephyrin insisted. Apex predators cannot be trusted. They will always revert to their nature when circumstances demand it. I noticed the other delegates nodding along like this was some kind of universal truth instead of the cosmic-level cowardice it clearly was. Fine, I said, feeling that familiar rush of adrenaline that had gotten me through 3 years of deep space emergencies. You want proof that Boris can be trusted? Give me 24 hours. 24 hours for what? Kreltax pulsed nervously. To prove that your entire understanding of apex predators is wrong. If I can demonstrate that Boris is not only trained but capable of complex reasoning and emotional intelligence, Earth gets its membership. If I can't, I shrugged. Well, then I guess we'll just have to find our own way in this big, scary universe. The silence that followed was broken only by Boris's contented purring as he continued his epic battle with the dust speck. You would stake your species' future on a beast, Valtara squeaked in disbelief. I'm staking it on a partner, I corrected. There's a difference, though I'm starting to think you folks might not understand that concept. 24 hours later, I stood in the station's main amphitheater, facing an audience of about 50 alien diplomats who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. Boris sat beside me, perfectly calm, occasionally glancing at the crowd, with the kind of mild interest you'd show a mildly entertaining hologram. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted gelatinous life forms, I began, ignoring the offended rippling from Krelthax's direction. Allow me to introduce you to actual interspecies cooperation. I turned to Boris. All right, big guy, let's start simple. Sit. Boris sat. A few aliens gasped like I'd just performed a miracle instead of the most basic command known to anyone who'd ever owned a pet. Stay. I walked to the other side of the amphitheater. Boris didn't move. Come. He padded over to me with that liquid grace that made 400 pounds look like a gentle breeze. More gasps from the peanut gallery. Parlor tricks, Zephyrin announced, though his voice carried less conviction than before. Any creature can be conditioned to respond to basic commands through repetition and food rewards. Oh, you think this is about food rewards? I grinned. Boris, show them the emergency protocols. Without hesitation, Boris moved to the nearest emergency panel and pressed the activation sequence with his paw. The lights dimmed to emergency amber, and he immediately positioned himself between me and the main exit, scanning the room for threats. Emergency protocol activated, I explained to the suddenly very quiet audience. Boris understands the difference between a drill and a real emergency. He knows to secure exits, protect non-combatants, and maintain visual contact with potential escape routes. I reset the system and Boris relaxed, returning to his position beside me. That proves nothing, Veltar squeaked, though he'd moved slightly behind a larger delegate. Trained responses to stimuli, no different from an automated system. Automated system? I looked down at Boris, who was now eyeing the purple blob with what I'd learned was his calculating expression. Boris, what do you think about that assessment? Boris tilted his head, studying Veltar for a long moment. Then he walked over to the amphitheater's control panel, pressed a sequence of buttons with surprising precision, and projected a holographic display of the station's layout. Using his paw, he traced a path from our current location to the medical bay, then to the primary docking bay, then to 3 different emergency shelters. He's showing you evacuation routes, I said, trying to keep the smugness out of my voice and failing spectacularly. All optimized for different types of emergencies. Boris studied the station's schematics during our approach and memorized the most efficient paths for preserving life. The silence stretched on until Ambassador Glubpoor finally spoke up. The creature can read tactical displays? The creature, I said, emphasizing the word, can read, analyze, and synthesize information faster than your average cadet. He's also trained in basic first aid, can operate communication equipment, and once helped me reprogram a failing life support system. I noticed several delegates leaning forward now, their initial terror giving way to what looked suspiciously like curiosity. But surely, Krelhax interjected, his orange pulsing now more uncertain than indignant, in a crisis situation, instinct would override training. Apex predators revert to their nature when threatened. The nature? I raised an eyebrow. You mean protective, loyal, and willing to face danger for their pack? Yeah, that sounds terrible. Boris chose that moment to demonstrate his understanding of irony by walking over to the water dispenser, operating it with practiced ease and bringing me a cup. He then returned to the dispenser and brought water to the 3 nearest delegates. Still think he's just following programmed responses? I asked, as a tiny insectoid delegate accepted the water cup with trembling appendages. For the first time since we'd arrived, I saw doubt creeping into their compound eyes and sensory organs. Good. It was about time someone in this galaxy started questioning their assumptions. Just as I was savoring the sight of 50 alien diplomats reconsidering their entire worldview, the station's emergency klaxons decided to throw their own party. The kind of party that involved flashing red lights, automatic blast doors, and a computerized voice announcing in that cheerfully clinical tone that only emergency systems can manage. Hull breach detected. Hostile borders confirmed. All personnel report to emergency stations. Well, I said, watching the color drain from various alien appendages, this should be interesting. Boris was already moving before I finished speaking. He'd positioned himself between me and the main entrance, ears forward, every muscle coiled and ready. His amber eyes swept the room with the kind of focused intensity that said he was cataloging threats, escape routes, and tactical advantages faster than most beings could process fear. The alien delegates, meanwhile, were demonstrating exactly why their species had survived by hiding from apex predators instead of working with them. Veltar had somehow managed to compress himself into a corner, vibrating at a frequency that suggested imminent panic. Zephyrim was frantically trying to contact security on his communicator while backing toward the emergency exits, and Krelthax was pulsing through colors I was pretty sure weren't in any diplomatic handbook. "Pirates," gasped Ambassador Glubpoor, his gills fluttering with terror. "The Crimson Nebula Raiders. They've been hitting diplomatic stations for months." "The security forces," squeaked another delegate. "They're overwhelmed. We need to evacuate immediately." I watched as 50 of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations prepared to abandon ship at the first sign of trouble. Real inspiring leadership there. "Boris," I said quietly. "Tactical assessment." He moved to the holographic display he'd activated earlier, studying the station layout with those calculating eyes. After a moment, he began tracing patterns with his paw, showing me something that made my blood run cold. The pirates weren't just randomly attacking. They were systematically cutting off escape routes, herding everyone toward the primary docking bay. They're not here for the station, I realized. They're here for hostages, specifically diplomatic hostages. Hostages? Krelhax's pulsing shifted to a shade of blue that probably meant either existential terror or really bad seafood. "We must flee. The security protocols demand immediate evacuation." "To where?" I gestured at Boris's tactical display. "They've got the main docking bay surrounded and the secondary exits blocked. Your security protocols are walking you straight into a trap." The realization hit the assembled delegates like a cosmic freight train. The civilized, advanced species who'd spent millennia avoiding conflict were about to become very expensive prizes for some 2-bit space pirates. "The emergency shelters," suggested Veltar, his voice climbing toward frequencies that probably qualified as a weapon in some systems. "We can hide until rescue arrives." Hide. I looked at Boris, who was now studying the real-time tactical display with the kind of professional interest he usually reserved for particularly challenging prey. "How long can those shelters hold against determined pirates with cutting equipment?" The silence that followed answered that question pretty thoroughly. "There is another option," I said, feeling that familiar rush of adrenaline that meant I was about to do something either brilliant or spectacularly stupid. "We fight our way out." "Fight?" Zephyrim's multiple eyes widened in horror. "We are diplomats. Civilized beings. We don't fight." "No," I agreed, scratching Boris behind the ears as he continued analyzing attack patterns. "You don't. But we do." I turned to address the room, noting how they all instinctively moved closer to Boris despite their earlier protests about his savage nature. Funny how quickly civilization goes out the airlock when actual danger shows up. "Here's the situation," I announced. "The pirates have you boxed in. Your security forces are either dead, captured, or too busy protecting the station's core systems to mount a rescue. You can sit in those emergency shelters and hope they get bored and leave, or you can trust the monster you were all so afraid of to get you out of here alive." Boris chose that moment to demonstrate his understanding of dramatic timing by walking over to the emergency weapons locker, keying in the security code with his paw, and methodically selecting equipment with the kind of professional competence that suggested this wasn't his first rodeo. "The creature knows weapons protocols?" whispered Ambassador Glubpoor. "The creature," I said, accepting a pulse rifle from Boris, who'd somehow figured out my preferred grip configuration, "knows how to keep his pack alive. The question is whether you're smart enough to let him." The sound of cutting equipment echoing through the station's corridors made the decision for them. Whatever philosophical objections they had to apex predators suddenly seemed a lot less important than the possibility of becoming cosmic merchandise. "What do you need us to do?" asked Kreltax, his pulsing now a resigned shade of purple. I grinned, feeling the familiar partnership rhythm as Boris moved to secure the amphitheater's secondary exits. "Stay close, follow orders, and try not to get in the way of the professional." The irony wasn't lost on me. The galaxy's most civilized species were about to be saved by the monster they'd spent 2 days trying to lock up. What followed was probably the most educational 47 minutes in galactic diplomatic history. Not that anyone was keeping track of time, while Boris systematically dismantled every assumption these aliens had about apex predators, cooperation, and what it actually meant to be civilized. The first pirate team came through the main entrance, expecting to find a bunch of cowering diplomats. Instead, they found Boris crouched behind an overturned conference table, ears flat against his skull, eyes locked on the doorway, with the kind of focused intensity that said someone was about to have a very bad day. "Maya," I called softly. 3 tangos, light armor, energy weapons, standard breach formation. Boris's response was immediate and terrifying. He moved like liquid death, covering the distance between his position and the first pirate in a heartbeat. The raider's weapon clattered to the floor as 400 pounds of Siberian tiger demonstrated why evolution had spent millions of years perfecting the art of the pounce. "Stun only," I commanded, and Boris adjusted his attack mid-leap, delivering a precisely controlled blow that dropped the pirate without killing him. The second raider managed to get off 1 shot before Boris was on him, and the third surrendered so fast I'm pretty sure he broke some kind of galactic record. Behind me, 50 alien diplomats watched in stunned silence as the monster they'd been so afraid of demonstrated the kind of controlled, tactical violence that their civilized security forces had apparently never mastered. "How?" whispered Veltar, his purple form trembling but no longer with fear. "How did you teach a predator to show mercy?" I secured the pirate's weapons while Boris maintained overwatch, his amber eyes scanning for additional threats. "We didn't teach him mercy," I said. "We taught him discrimination. There's a difference between a threat and a defeated enemy." The second wave came 15 minutes later. This time the pirates had learned from their colleagues' mistakes. They came in hard and fast, with heavy weapons and tactical coordination that suggested they weren't complete amateurs. Boris was ready for them. "Flanking maneuver," I called, and he was already moving, using the amphitheater's architecture to his advantage. He disappeared into the maintenance crawlways with the kind of silent grace that made me glad we were on the same side. The pirates advanced cautiously, sweeping the room with their weapons. They never saw Boris coming from above. He dropped from the ceiling like a furry nightmare, landing between 2 raiders and immediately rolling to avoid their crossfire. His movements were fluid, efficient, and absolutely beautiful in their precision. Every strike was calculated, every dodge perfectly timed. "Suppression fire," I shouted, laying down covering fire with the pulse rifle while Boris worked his magic. The aliens huddled behind their makeshift barricades, but I noticed they were watching now, really watching, as Boris demonstrated what millions of years of evolutionary partnership could accomplish. When the smoke cleared, 6 more pirates were unconscious and Boris was sitting calmly beside their weapons, tail twitching with what I'd learned was his version of professional satisfaction. "It's impossible," breathed Zephyr. "He's fighting with strategy, with purpose. This isn't animal instinct." "No," I agreed, reloading my weapon as Boris reported the all clear with a soft chuff. "This is what happens when you don't try to dominate other species, when you learn to work with them instead of against them." The third wave never came. Word had apparently spread through the pirate ranks that the diplomatic station was defended by something they'd never encountered before. A predator that fought with intelligence, restraint, and tactical awareness. "I don't understand," said Ambassador Glubpoor, his gills fluttering with confusion. "Your species formed alliances with apex predators. How is this possible?" I looked down at Boris, who was now methodically checking the secured pirates for concealed weapons with the kind of thoroughness that suggested he'd done this before. "Because we didn't start with the assumption that different meant enemy," I said. "We started with the assumption that different meant opportunity." "Opportunity?" Krelhax pulsed a confused shade of yellow. "Humans didn't evolve at the top of the food chain," I explained, settling into what Boris and I called our post-mission routine. "We evolved in the middle. We had to learn to work with predators, prey, and everything in between. We had to become partners instead of tyrants." Boris finished his security sweep and padded over to me, bumping my shoulder with his massive head, in the gesture that meant mission accomplished, can we eat now? Your species eliminated or avoided apex predators because you saw them as threats, I continued, scratching behind Boris's ears. We befriended them because we saw them as allies. The difference isn't in our technology or our intelligence, it's in our willingness to trust. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. This wasn't the silence of fear or confusion. This was the silence of beings who were fundamentally reconsidering everything they thought they knew about survival, civilization, and what it meant to be truly advanced. The pirates, whispered Veltar. They fled from one creature. An entire raiding party, defeated by a single predator and his human partner. Not defeated, I corrected. Outclassed. There's a difference between winning a fight and demonstrating that the fight was never necessary in the first place. Boris yawned, showing those impressive teeth that had terrified them all just days ago. Now somehow the sight was almost comforting. We've been wrong, said Zephyrin quietly. For millennia we've been wrong about everything. The aftermath of our little pirate problem was almost as entertaining as the main event. Station security finally showed up about an hour later, armed to the teeth and ready to face down a major incursion, only to find 50 alien diplomats having what appeared to be a collective existential crisis, while a Siberian tiger calmly groomed himself in the corner. Captain Rodriguez, panted Security Chief Zalkan, a heavily armored creature who looked like someone had crossed a rhinoceros with a filing cabinet. We received reports of hostile boarders and weapons fire. What's the situation? I gestured casually at the neat pile of unconscious pirates that Boris had helpfully arranged near the main entrance. Situation resolved. No casualties on our side. The raiders have been secured and are ready for processing. Zalkan's optical sensors swept the room, taking in the overturned furniture, scorch marks on the walls, and the unmistakable evidence of a firefight. Then his gaze landed on Boris, who looked up from his grooming long enough to give the security chief a polite nod. Your creature did this? He asked, his voice carrying the kind of awe usually reserved for natural phenomena. My partner, I corrected automatically, then caught myself smiling at how natural the correction had become. And yes, he did most of the heavy lifting, I just provided tactical support. What followed was probably the most awkward debriefing in galactic history. Zalkan kept asking questions about combat protocols and tactical assessments while the alien diplomats sat in stunned silence, occasionally glancing at Boris like he might suddenly sprout wings and start dispensing cosmic wisdom. The boarders were experienced raiders, Zalkan noted, reviewing his scanner readings. Military-grade equipment, coordinated assault patterns. How did you manage to subdue them without casualties? Professional standards, I said, watching Boris investigate a particularly interesting scorch mark on the wall. When you work with apex predators, you learn the difference between necessary force and excessive force. Boris doesn't kill unless killing is the only option. Remarkable, muttered Ambassador Glibpor. We assumed predators were driven by bloodlust and instinct, but your creature showed restraint even in combat. He showed intelligence, corrected Krelthax, his pulsing now a thoughtful shade of blue. Strategic thinking, tactical awareness, these are not the qualities we associate with savage beasts. I was about to launch into another explanation about partnership and evolution when Boris decided to provide his own demonstration. He padded over to the amphitheater's main control panel, pressed a sequence of buttons with practiced precision, and activated the holographic display system. The projection that appeared showed a detailed tactical analysis of the pirate attack, complete with movement patterns, weapons signatures, and strategic assessments. Boris had been monitoring and cataloging the entire engagement, creating a comprehensive after-action report that would have impressed a military academy. He documented the entire encounter, whispered Veltar, his purple form rippling with something that might have been admiration. For training purposes, for future reference. For the pack, I said simply. Everything Boris does is about protecting and improving the pack, whether that's me, you, or the entire crew of a deep space vessel. Boris finished his presentation by highlighting weak points in the station's security grid, suggesting improvements to defensive positions, and even recommending better communication protocols for emergency situations. Then he looked at me with those amber eyes that said, "Did I do good?" And my heart just about melted. "The vote," announced Councillor Zephyrim suddenly. "We need to hold the vote." "What vote?" I asked, though I had a pretty good idea where this was going. "Earth's membership in the Galactic Alliance," Krelthax pulsed, his color shifting to something that looked suspiciously like embarrassment. "The vote that we postponed because we believed your species was too primitive to join civilized society." The irony was so thick you could have cut it with a plasma torch. Here they were, the galaxy's most advanced civilizations, asking to admit the species they'd just called savage after that same species had saved their lives. As in favor of immediate membership for Earth, Zephyrin called out. 50 appendages, tentacles, and various other voting appendages shot up immediately. The vote was unanimous. Well, I said, trying to keep the smugness out of my voice and failing spectacularly, I guess that settles that. Boris chose that moment to demonstrate his understanding of diplomatic protocol by walking over to the water dispenser, operating it with his usual precision, and bringing drinks to each of the delegates. But this time, instead of just delivering the water, he performed a small bow to each recipient. And did he just... Veltar squeaked. Diplomatic courtesy, I confirmed. Boris understands the importance of proper etiquette in formal situations. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of 50 alien diplomats simultaneously reconsidering everything they thought they knew about intelligence, civilization, and what it meant to be truly advanced. Captain Rodriguez, Krelthak said finally, his pulsing now a warm shade of gold. On behalf of the Galactic Alliance, I formally welcome Earth to our Confederation. Your species brings unique perspectives to our collective wisdom. Our species, I said, scratching Boris behind the ears one more time, brings partnerships. We bring the understanding that different doesn't mean dangerous, and that the strongest civilizations are built on cooperation, not domination. Boris yawned, showing those impressive teeth that had once terrified them all. Now, somehow, the sight was almost reassuring. There is one final demonstration, I announced, grinning as I walked over to the amphitheater's main exit. Boris, would you mind? Without hesitation, Boris padded over to the door controls, but instead of simply operating them, he sat down beside the panel and looked at me expectantly. The door, Boris, I said. He pressed the activation sequence with his paw, and the door slid open smoothly. Then he remained sitting beside it, amber eyes alert, waiting for his next command. Apex creatures can't be trained, I said to the assembled delegates. But here's my tiger, opening doors and waiting for commands. The question isn't whether apex predators can be trained. The question is whether the galaxy is ready to learn from them. Boris's tail twitched once, which I'd learned was his way of saying, mission accomplished, can we go home now? Welcome to the food chain, I said, walking through the door with my 400-pound partner padding silently beside me. Try not to get eaten. Behind us, 50 of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations sat in stunned silence, finally beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, they weren't as civilized as they'd thought. And somewhere in the cosmos, a species that had learned to work with apex predators instead of fearing them was about to teach the galaxy what real civilization looked like.